Hey Fresh Family, it's Mark Ellis, and welcome to another episode of RT Essentials. You might think you have a pretty solid handle on the Resident Evil films. Milla Jovovich, ugly mutants, a lot of gunplay, some Rams theme songs, and you're good to go. But after 7 films, there's actually a whole lot more going on with this franchise. You got a wide variety of approaches to the narrative, villains, tones, settings, and occasionally crafty references back to the source material. And yes, some Crystal Method songs as well. It's a rich, robust blend. But before we start, I gotta throw up the spoiler warning because we will basically be going over the plot of each film, so you have been warned. Without further ado, here's our RT Essentials guide to the history of the Resident Evil live-action movie franchise. Resident Evil. The very first Resident Evil film hit theaters in 2002 and comes from writer-director Paul W.S. Anderson, not to be confused with the other Paul Anderson. This is the one who set the video game adaptation gold standard with his 1995 big screen take on Mortal Kombat. The kickoff to the RE franchise still has the highest audience score of the entire series with a 67% fresh rating. It's also holding on to the second highest tomato meter score from RT-approved critics at 36%. That's still very rotten, but hey, it could be worse. The movie opens with a brief introduction to the Umbrella Corporation, the world's largest business conglomerate, commanding a tremendous amount of economic and political influence around the globe. And wouldn't you know, even though Umbrella has a pleasant and widely trusted public face, they also secretly dabble in all kinds of unethical, covert research into military technology, bioweaponry, and genetic experimentation. You gotta keep the shareholders happy, am I right? Though Umbrella's hometown of Raccoon City gets explored in later entries in the series, the first film mainly takes place in just 2 locations, a mysterious home known as the Spencer Mansion, and the massive secret lab hidden underneath known as the Hive. That's where Umbrella scientists are working on the genetically engineered T-virus, which can grant people all kinds of supernatural powers, but also has that little downside of, turning them into monstrous zombie-like undead creatures of the night. Might hold up the FDA approval just a bit. Turning your subjects into an unholy abomination, it's sort of a red flag. The movie opens with Alice, played by Milla Jovovich, waking up in the Spencer Mansion with no memory and eventually making her way into the Hive. We ultimately learn that she was part of a plot involving some environmental activists to break into the Hive and steal a copy of the T-virus, but things went about as wrong as they could possibly go. The virus was accidentally unleashed, and almost everyone in the complex became a homicidal mutant terror. The Hive has been locked down by Umbrella's artificially intelligent control program, known as the Red Queen, and the rest of the movie finds Alice and a few other, much less important survivors attempting to locate an antiviral solution before escaping the Hive. The film ends with Alice getting out alone, only to find that all of Raccoon City has been overrun and destroyed. I mean, it is Raccoon City, so you expect a few trash cans to be knocked over. Obviously, the Umbrella Corp, Raccoon City, and the T-Virus are all core concepts from the video games, but the story also lifts the Spencer Mansion and the secret lab hidden beneath directly from the first Resident Evil video game. There are also some notable Easter eggs and quick references for eagle-eyed Resident Evil fans. A police cruiser bears the logo for STARS, S-T-A-R-S, Raccoon City's Special Tactics and Rescue Squad. The doctored photos Alice finds in the mansion showing her wedding day directly recall similar photos featured in that very first game. The Hive's underground train was directly inspired by a sequence from Resident Evil 2. And finally, a copy of the Raccoon City Times has the headline, "Horrid Raccoon! More victims dead!" a direct lift from the intro to the first game. Also kind of editorializing there. Let's keep it unbiased, newspapers. Resident Evil Apocalypse. We move directly from a film with some of the highest ratings for the entire Resident Evil series to one of the lowest ranked entries. The 2004 sequel, Apocalypse, scored a 19% on the tomato meter, making it the critics' pick for the most rotten of all the RE films. And that's saying something because, according to the tomato meter, this series, not exactly Toy Story. Apocalypse draws key inspiration from the two games that were most recently released back in 2004, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and Resident Evil Code Veronica. The shootout between Umbrella's military force, the Raccoon Police, STARS, and the Undead mirrors a scene from the Resident Evil 3 intro at several points, and a sequence in which Alice running from a helicopter and using her weapon to detonate a series of explosives recreates the opening cutscene from Code Veronica.
You're going down, you son of a
The first film was considered a financial success, so the budget for the sequel was expanded to $50 million, $11 million over the original. Paul W.S. Anderson once again worked on the script, but passed along directing duties to Alexander Witt while he kicked off yet another franchise, Alien vs. Predator. Witt was an accomplished second-unit director who worked on numerous Bond films and had collaborated with Ridley Scott on multiple projects in the past. In fact, he made sure to include a lot of helicopters in Apocalypse because he enjoyed working with them so much during Ridley's Black Hawk Down shoot. Apocalypse opens with Raccoon City under strict quarantine to prevent the spread of the zombie infection. Actress Sienna Guillory is introduced as central game character Jill Valentine, a disgraced operative with Raccoon City PD's Special Tactics and Rescue Squad, the STARS. The filmmakers felt strongly that Guillory should wear Jill's familiar costume from the game in the movie, despite it not being particularly realistic for a police officer, so they added some dialogue about a heat wave to help explain it. Oded Fehr also co-stars as Carlos Oliveira, a character introduced in the game Resident Evil 3, but he wears a totally different costume in the film, so I guess it was a lot less hot where he was.
I count 3 of them. They got us boxed in.
The film's primary nemesis is Alice's old pal Matt Addison, who's been horribly mutated into the villain Nemesis and has been tasked by Umbrella with tracking her down. The film ends with the Nemesis switching sides to help Alice and dying in a blaze of glory while fighting Umbrella troops as the company detonates a nuclear bomb over the city. Though Alice appears to have been killed in the blast, she wakes up in another research facility with newly developed telekinetic powers brought on by exposure to the T-virus and manages to escape. That is, before we see indications that she's now part of something called Program Alice and an essential key to Umbrella's future plans. We also find out in this film that the T-virus was accidentally created by Umbrella scientist Dr. Charles Ashford, played by Jared Harris, who is attempting to cure his daughter Angela's genetic disability. The Ashfords are named in honor of the Ashford family from the video game series. The initial plan was also to make Angela the model for the Hive's AI protector, the Red Queen, but this concept was ultimately abandoned and cut from the final film. In fact, this entire Dr. Ashford origin story for the T-virus will ultimately be retconned in the film The Final Chapter. More on that in a bit. Resident Evil Extinction. Anderson returned once more to write the third RE film, 2007's Extinction, but this time handed directing duties over to Australian Russell Mulcahy, best known for the original 1986 Highlander. He's the go-to guy if your franchise features immortal characters, I suppose. The film opens 5 years after Apocalypse, after the T-virus has gone worldwide and triggered a global apocalypse. Because the virus is fatal to so many kinds of organisms, it has also turned the surface of much of the planet into a desert, which is a huge bummer. Human refugees have largely abandoned cities and started living in mobile convoys to stay ahead of the migrating undead. This makes it the first film in the franchise to fully break with the established series chronology. The most recent game, Resident Evil 4, came out in 2005, but it's set in a world that has not yet been totally overrun by the undead or transformed into a desert. Alice, whose T-virus infection has rendered her a full-on super soldier by this point, is traveling alone and finds a journal indicating that a settlement in Alaska called Arcadia may still be zombie-free. She hooks up with a group of survivors, including old friends Carlos and LJ from Apocalypse and game character Claire Redfield, and convinces them to travel north with her. Carlos, we should note, is given his recognizable costume from Resident Evil 3 in this film, which he didn't sport in the previous entry. Meanwhile, back at Umbrella, the evil Dr. Alexander Isaacs, who is not from the games, but whose name was inspired by frequent Paul W.S. Anderson collaborator Jason Isaacs, is trying to clone Alice to recreate her psychic powers. He tests the clones in a mock-up of the mansion and Hive from the first film, but so far, none have survived. Ultimately, he determines that he needs the original Project Alice back in order to harvest her blood. This film also introduces us to Umbrella's senior executive Albert Wesker, another character who was introduced in the very first Resident Evil game way back in 1996. In the films, he's Umbrella's evil chairman.
Project Alice, the subject of domestication, is of the highest priority. We will concentrate on this to the exclusion of all other research. We'll expect an updated report within a week.
Alice's group clashes with Umbrella's forces in post-apocalyptic Las Vegas, where I hear Tom Jones is still performing. Dr. Isaacs gets bitten and transforms into a cinematic take on the Tyrant, a familiar boss character that appears in numerous RE games. Carlos sacrifices himself to clear a path for the convoy, who get into a chopper and head for Alaska. Alice, meanwhile, stays behind in a Vegas Umbrella facility to determine whether or not her blood really can be used to create a T-virus cure. Despite going in its own direction, Extinction features a number of other shoutouts to elements of the game and established Resident Evil lore. Dr. Isaac's office, for example, features some of the healing herbs that help restore playable characters' health meters in the games. We also get a memorable attack from some genetically altered crows, an irritatingly familiar RE foe. Anderson said that his concept for the super undead, more intelligent and coordinated baddies, was inspired by human enemies known as Ganados in Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil Afterlife.
Chris and Claire Redfield. You've really become quite an inconvenience for me.
I told you I'd be bringing a few friends.
Paul W.S. Anderson returned to the director's chair for 2010's Resident Evil Afterlife and helmed all the series' remaining films starring Mila Jovovich as Alice. This was also the first RE film to be shot in 3D. Anderson became convinced to try the technology after seeing advanced footage from James Cameron's Avatar. He and his crew then spent 2 weeks during pre-production just mastering their new 3D camera system, and also trying to find a role for some 9-foot-tall blue aliens. Afterlife includes another primary game character, Wentworth Miller as Chris Redfield, and also brings back Ali Larter as Claire Redfield and Sienna Galori as Jill Valentine, while debuting Sean Roberts as the new Albert Wesker with a new look more closely resembling his game counterpart. He replaces Jason O'Mara, who played Wesker in Extinction. Notably, this is Chris Redfield's only appearance in all of the Anderson Resident Evil films. Aside from being related to Claire, he has very little in common with his game counterpart. Afterlife is mostly based around elements from the game Resident Evil 5, which came out the year before, in 2009. The Scarab-like mind control devices and the large-scale final confrontation with Wesker were all lifted more or less directly from the game, and the so-called Axeman mutant is visually based on the game's executioner Magini enemies. Resident Evil 5 largely concerns a new illness impacting people infected by parasites known as Las Plagas, but because the film series wasn't yet introducing this new concept, all Plaga-related mutations are credited once more to our old friend the T-virus. The story of Afterlife picks up 1 year after the events of Extinction and opens with Alice making good on her threat and invading the Tokyo Umbrella headquarters along with her army of clones. During the assault, Wesker injects her with antivirus, robbing her of her superpowers, but they both manage to escape before the facility is destroyed. 6 months later, Alice finally gets to Alaska to rejoin Claire and the other survivors. The world seems to be slowly coming back to life by this point. It's no longer a completely barren Mad Max-esque hellscape. There's even trees again. Together, they travel to Los Angeles and hook up with another group of survivors, one of whom I hope includes me, living in a prison there. Oh, prison? Never mind. I'm out. Alice also discovers that Arcadia is not a refuge in Alaska like she thought, but a ship that ferries people along the Pacific coast. The group manages to escape the undead and reach the ship, only to find that it's actually owned by Umbrella and used to round up people for, dun dun dun, further experimentation. Man, they really thought of everything, those Umbrella folks. Too bad, they're all just so darn evil. On board, the group finds a mutating Wesker who needs regular infusions of non-contaminated DNA to keep himself under control and vaguely humanoid. He greets Alice with a familiar line from the game. "You've really become quite an inconvenience for me." After an extended fight, Wesker appears to die in an explosion, and everything seems to have worked out itself for Alice and our heroes. That is, until a new squadron of Umbrella troops arrives, led by a scarab-wearing Jill Valentine, and attacks. It's a cliffhanger! Resident Evil Retribution. As promised, 2012's Retribution picks up right after that shocking Afterlife ending, with a mind-controlled Jill Valentine and a fleet of V-22 Ospreys attacking the survivors on the Arcadia freighter. The fate of many characters from Afterlife are purposely left ambiguous while Alice is recaptured. Or isn't it by this point like recaptured Part 2, the sequel? It's hard to keep up. Anyway, she awakens in yet another Umbrella facility, which features multiple areas made up to look like different world cities, simulating their respective zombie outbreaks. Inside this new facility, Claire will meet several new characters from the games, including Leon S. Kennedy, Ada Wong, and Barry Burton. She'll also encounter a number of dead characters who've returned as clones, like Michelle Rodriguez as Rain Ocampo, an old Hive ally from the very first RE film, Oded Fur as Carlos Oliveira, and Colin Salmon as James 1 Shade. Upon arriving at Central Control, Alice meets Wong, who's an agent working for Wesker. They have an initial fight, closely modeled on a sequence from the game Resident Evil 4.
Wesker, I see you've made yourself at home.
Well, I must say, it does have a certain ease to it.
It seems both Wong and Wesker have broken with Umbrella now that the company is actually being controlled by the Red Queen, the reactivated rogue AI from the first Resident Evil film. She's trying to wipe out all of humanity, while they're determined to ensure our future survival. So wait, now Wesker's a good guy? I guess, but look, do not get too attached. There's not a ton of loyalty in this Resident Evil world, probably because there's just so many clones walking around. Ultimately, Alice and her new ally Leon are able to destroy and escape the new facility, which it turns out was underwater the whole time, but they're still being pursued by Jill Valentine in a submarine, along with an evil clone of Rain Ocampo. Alice rips the mind control device off of Jill's chest, restoring her to normal, and the group travels together to Wesker's new headquarters in a heavily fortified and barricaded, get this, White House. The film does introduce the Las Plagas parasite that was first established in the game Resident Evil 5, but went unmentioned in the previous film. Another sequence involving zombies chasing a Rolls-Royce Phantom was inspired by a scene from Resident Evil 5, but the vehicle was originally a Hummer in the game. A Hummer into a Rolls-Royce Phantom? That's what we in the biz call an upgrade. Resident Evil: The Final Chapter.
You're fast, but you're not too smart.
The Jovovich-Anderson Resident Evil chronology comes to a close in 2017's The Final Chapter, which means this is one of the only horror movies with a title like The Final Chapter, and it actually makes good on its promise. I'm looking right at you, Freddy's Dead. The Final Nightmare? The old school Resident Evil series also went out on a high note. This is the highest grossing Resident Evil film from the entire run to date, hauling in $312 million on a $40 million budget. It also has the highest tomato meter score from RT-approved critics, with a strongest 37%. The film opens with a flashback showing Dr. James Marcus, founder of Umbrella, inventing the T-virus. What about Dr. Ashford, you might ask? Forget Dr. Ashford. Dr. Marcus uses his invention to save the life of his daughter, Alicia, but soon learns about the virus's deadly side effects. He wants to destroy it right away, but his business partner, Dr. Isaacs, instead hires Wesker to kill him and takes over the company himself. Alicia later becomes the model for the Red Queen, the AI that controls Umbrella's operations. The character of James Marcus was introduced in the game Resident Evil 0 as one of 3 founders of Umbrella. This Dr. Marcus always had dangerous and unethical experiments in mind and was not motivated by helping his daughter. In the game timeline, he's also betrayed and killed by Wesker, because I guess some things never change. Jumping to some time after the end of Retribution, Alice is now alone in Washington, D.C. after the White House has been destroyed. She's attacked by 2 recognizable baddies from the games, a portly zombie known as a Javo from RE6, and a flying Capepio from Resident Evil 5. She finds a bunker with weapons, but it's also equipped with a fax machine, allowing the Red Queen, who's been tracking her via satellite, to communicate. The Red Queen says she is also now fighting Umbrella to save humanity and wants to help Alice, directing her back to the Hive and a supposed airborne cure for the T-virus. Ever Gabo Anderson, the real-life daughter of Mila Jovovich and Paul W.S. Anderson, plays the Red Queen in the film. Originally, it was only going to be a voiceover role, but the visual effects team opted to actually record her on set, then digitally alter her appearance, rather than animating the character entirely from scratch. Arriving back in Raccoon City after being chased by Dr. Isaacs in a tank, Alice meets back up with Claire Redfield, who's rounded up a new group of survivors and taken refuge in a skyscraper. Claire's outfit in this film, by the way, is lifted directly from the one she wears in Resident Evil Revelations 2. Of all the characters, she suffers the most for her fashion. The group survives more attacks by Isaac's soldiers and some mutated dogs, but finally gets through to the Hive using the crater created by the nuclear explosion in the second film. Remember that? Finally, Alice and Claire encounter yet another version of Dr. Isaacs. This one says he's the real Dr. Isaacs, and the one in the tank is a clone, but he may not be right about this, and honestly, at this point, who can keep track of all these Isaacs?
Your little friend won't be able to help you now.
You can't run anymore.
I wasn't running.
Dr. Isaacs also makes another shocking revelation. Alice herself is a clone of Alicia Marcus, the daughter of Umbrella founder James Marcus and the original inspiration for the T-virus. The real original Alicia is still alive and helps her clone and Claire blow up the Hive and release the airborne version of the antivirus, which will slowly return everything to normal as it spreads around the globe. Alicia also uploads memories of her real childhood for Alice, giving her some kind of sense for her own backstory. This film was purposely designed to conclude Alice's story, but give the producers an opening for more installments in this timeline before potentially rebooting the entire franchise. So it closes with Alice heading off to kill more monsters as the T-virus slowly dies around the world. There were original plans to actually kill off Alice's character at the end of the final chapter, but Jovovich wanted her to have a happy ending. And I'd say she's earned it. It's not easy to jump backwards while firing 2 guns and hit your target, or anything for that matter. Alice, you deserve happiness. Resident Evil, welcome to Raccoon City.
See, Umbrella, they had an incident. I'm talking Chernobyl, if you know what I mean. People are getting sick. You gotta help us, Claire. Let the world know what's really going on.
2021's Welcome to Raccoon City completely reboots the franchise with no direct connections to the previous 6 films. It comes from writer-director Johannes Roberts, who previously helmed 47 Meters Down and The Strangers Pray at Night. Plans for a reboot were already underway while the final chapter was still in theaters. James Wan had been attached briefly as a producer, but left the project to work on the new Mortal Kombat reboot instead. Greg Russo worked with Wan on an early script idea. He also ended up on that Mortal Kombat movie. They were considering a new project more directly inspired by Resident Evil 7 Biohazard and the focus on a character suffering in isolation. Roberts' film, on the other hand, is directly based on the first 2 games in the Resident Evil franchise, and he was particularly focused on capturing their familiar rain-soaked, dark, spooky atmosphere with more focus on horror than action. He specifically cites the 2019 remake of Resident Evil 2 as his main and direct visual and tonal inspiration for the film.
Every story has a beginning. Discover the origin of evil.
He even experimented with restrictive camera angles that mimic the look of a video game. So sometimes, for example, the film employs a high angle that almost looks like surveillance video, which would be unnatural in a film, but familiar to a gamer. As well, sometimes a character will walk off-screen and then disappear for a while without having the camera follow them. Raccoon City was also front-loaded with a lot of game characters who only found their way into the Jovovich films gradually over time, including Kaya Scodelario as Claire Redfield, Robbie Amell as Chris Redfield, Hannah John Kamen as Jill Valentine, Avon Jogia as Leon S. Kennedy, Tom Hopper as Albert Wesker, and Lily Gao as Ada Wong. The 2021 edition also integrated a few game characters who had never previously been featured in the films, like Neil McDonough as Umbrella virologist William Birkin, and Donal Logue as Raccoon City Chief of Police Brian Irons. One element the latest film shares with the previous installments is practical effects director Paul Jones. He also created Nemesis in Resident Evil Apocalypse and the Axemen for Afterlife and Retribution. And there you have it, everything you need to know about the history of Resident Evil from our evil residents to yours. So until next time, don't forget your healing herbs, watch out for liquors, and keep it here on RT Essentials for more slow, methodical walks down the long, dark, terrifying, zombie-filled corridors of film history. I'm Mark Ellis, and we'll see you real soon.